Have you struggled to maintain a healthy weight despite making great efforts? You're not alone. Since around 1970, the rates of overweight and obesity have skyrocketed in the US and other industrialized nations. Why is this happening, and why is it so hard to lose weight? A good part of the explanation might lie in how the brain controls appetite and regulates weight. If we better understand how evolution has shaped the brain's response to food, we can look at how the modern food environment induces us to eat too much and figure out what we can do to change that. We're talking today with Stephan. Stephan is a neuroscientist who studied what drives many of us to overeat and become overweight, focusing on the role of brain circuits and how they respond to the food environment. Welcome to the podcast, Stephan.
Thanks for having me, Todd.
Yeah. So in today's episode, Stephan, we'd like to have you help us deconstruct the role that our brains play in eating and in overeating. And we didn't just all of a sudden as a society choose to, let's just start eating more, right? Or let's eat more snacks. There was something driving this. And you point to this idea of food cravings and that there's something about the food itself that's driving those cravings. Can you say more about that? And first of all, what is a craving? How does it different than generalized hunger? And what's driving those cravings?
I think basically it's fats in general, including seed oils, are brought together in delectable combinations that really stimulate the motivational circuits in our brains. So if you, at a really simple fundamental level, if you just ask the question, what makes a rodent overeat? Well, like how can you get a rodent to overeat as much as possible? And the answer is calorie dense, tasty human food. You just go to the grocery store, you buy tasty human food like cookies and salami and French fries and stuff like that. And you put a variety of it in their cage at all times, and they'll eat a bunch of it and get super fat, and they will ignore healthier food.
In fact, can you just give us a little bit of an insight into this observation that I think it was Anthony Sclafani had, where he was trying to get rats to become obese on some kind of rat chow and failing. And he had this chance discovery. Can you say, what happened there?
Yeah. So in the 1970s, this was kind of a landmark discovery in obesity research. 1970s, at that time, there was obesity. It was less prevalent than today, but it was still, a health problem that existed in society, and researchers were trying to study it. And they were trying to do it in various ways. A common way was you would add fat to their normal chow, and that the animals would gain weight, but it was slower and less reliable of a method of weight gain than they wanted. If you have these experimental models, you want them to get, if you're studying obesity, you want them to get really fat really fast.
Right.
Otherwise, it's inefficient,
And they weren't able to do that, right? They were having problems getting the rats to get fat.
And so one day, Anthony Sclafani was in the lab. This was back in the day when rats were just kind of around in the lab instead of locked in these intense facilities. And there was a rat on the lab bench, and there was also a bowl of Fruit Loops that I guess another graduate student must have been eating. And so Fruit Loops, for anyone who doesn't know, it's like this sugary breakfast cereal that has a kind of like fruity flavor. And the rat walked over to the Fruit Loops and started eating it voraciously. And this was really a strange, unexpected observation, because usually rats have this thing called neophobia, where they are really wary of new foods. They'll only eat a little bit, see if it makes them sick. And then if it doesn't, then they'll go back and eat more. But the rat was just chowing down on these Fruit Loops. And it occurred to Sclafani that maybe a way to make these animals fat would be to go to the grocery store and buy a variety of tasty human foods, things that humans like to eat, and put it in their cages. And that's what he did. And the results were spectacular. So their calorie intake went way up. Their body fatness increased rapidly. And you could give them an enriched environment, with lots of toys and stuff and cool things to do. That didn't stop the obesity. You could put a running wheel in their cage so they would exercise, and that made them gain less fat, but they still got quite fat.
But I guess, Was there any difference in the macronutrient composition of the Fruit Loops or any of these other supermarket foods, or was there something else about those foods?
Yeah, so this is a key question. And so for this, you have to look at other experiments where there's one in particular that I like where they actually manipulated, they compared side by side in mice the cafeteria diet, which is what I just described, versus a diet that's high in fat versus a diet that's high in sugar. And what they found was that the animals gained weight on the high fat refined diet and the high sugar refined diet, but not nearly as much as on the cafeteria diet. And calorie intake was also not as high. So basically, there is nothing you can do to a rodent pellet that makes it as fattening as tasty human food. There's no macronutrient combination. There's no amount of sugar. There's no amount or type of fat that you can put into a rodent pellet that makes it as fattening as a variety of highly palatable calorie dense human foods.
Okay, so what is it about these calorie dense human foods from the supermarket or from the cafeteria that makes rats and presumably humans want to eat them more than the same macronutrients, synthetically put together?
Yeah. So, first, let me acknowledge that I don't want to say that manipulating the nutrients in the food doesn't have any effect. I don't want people to come away with that. I'm just trying to emphasize that it is not as fattening as human highly palatable calorie dense food. So there is a portion of the effect that cannot be explained by just the nutrient composition of the food. And it's a pretty substantial portion actually. And so I think essentially what you see is their calorie intake goes up. So the question is, what is causing them to have increased eating drive relative to these, processed pellets? And I think there are a few different answers to that. One of them that you were kind of hinting at earlier is this heightened reward drive. So these foods, when you so certain types of foods, certain combinations of nutrients stimulate dopamine release in the brain more than others. And basically, highly processed, tasty human foods are optimized to increase dopamine release. Not explicitly, but just by selection for what is successful on the shelves. The things that sell are the things that reinforce purchase and consumption behavior, which almost by definition are the things that stimulate our dopamine. And so you have these foods that are very stimulating to food reward circuits in the brain, motivational circuits that drive our eating, that increase our eating drive independent of energy needs. And that is one of the things that stimulates, that I think probably stimulates these animals to overconsume. And then another thing is sensory specific satiety. So
Say more about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a term that I think was coined by Barbara Rolls, nutrition researcher. And essentially it's the concept that we can get full on foods that have a certain sensory profile, like a certain taste, but not full on foods that don't have that sensory profile. So for example, if you have a meal of steak and potatoes and salad, you can eat until you're full on those things. And then if somebody brings out another steak, you're not going to eat more steak. But if they bring out ice cream or a brownie or cookies, you're prepared to eat that different type of food. On the other hand,
they call that the second stomach, right? But
yeah,
it's almost like you have a different thing you can fill. So why is that? Why do you fill up on the steak and then you still have room for the dessert?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's basically two explanations. One of them is sensory specific satiety. So we experience satiety or fullness relative to specific sensory properties of food. So the brain is kind of like, I've had enough of this particular food, but that doesn't mean I haven't had enough of this other food. And so that's something that drives us to overeat a lot at buffets because there are foods that have a variety of sensory properties. every other bite, you've got a different sensory experience. And so you don't hit sensory specific satiety for a long time, and you end up over consuming. And you see in rodent studies, the variety per se, when you do controlled experiments, does impact their calorie intake and body fatness. And it's pretty substantial. So if you had just one calorie dense, palatable human food in the cage, you're not going to get the same effect as if you have a variety of calorie dense, palatable foods in terms of, the fattening effect in rodents.
Stephan, you're using this term palatability, suggesting there's something about the food itself, right? So what is it about foods that make them palatable? Is this an innate thing? Is it learned? And if it's learned, can it vary between cultures and people? Or is there an inherent property of these foods that innately appeals to us humans?
Yeah, it's both. So, and let me take a little step back and talk about palatability and what it means and what its importance is. Palatability is just how good a food tastes. And, I use that term a lot because it's a term that people understand. But the real concept that I think is more important is our motivational drive to eat. And that is something that is correlated usually with palatability, but it's not perfectly correlated. So, but that's really what I'm interested in mostly, is that dopamine release and the motivational drive and the learning eating behaviors and habits that it causes. So I use palatability again just kind of for its communication value. But what I'm really talking about is that motivational drive that's distinct from the conscious experience of pleasure, which is what palatability means, although they usually operate together. So having explained that, essentially there are specific food properties that the brain is hardwired to be motivated by and to release dopamine in response to. And the ones that are either known or strongly suspected are carbohydrate, including starch and sugar, fat and protein and salt and umami, glutamate, which is that umami meaty flavor in soy sauce and cooked meats and things. So those are things that the brain innately responds to. Almost anyone from any culture will enjoy those food properties. But through the process of conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning to be precise, we learn to we learn to like things that are associated with those properties. So if you eat, let's say, strong cheeses, let's say you grow up eating strong cheeses, let's say you grow up in France, your brain comes to associate the taste and the texture and the appearance and the aroma of that cheese with the concentrated fat and salt and protein that it delivers. And once your brain makes that association through dopamine mediated reinforcement, then you come to enjoy and be motivated by those sensory qualities.
So even the aroma before you've put it in your mouth, right?
Correct.
The aroma of the cinnamon bun or even the appearance of the cheese can all of a sudden start those circuits firing up.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is the dopamine release, initially it happens when you consume the food, but over time the dopamine release comes to be associated with those sensory cues. And so when you see the cheese or you smell it, or you smell the brownies coming out of the oven, or you're in a situation where you would normally have pizza with your colleagues or a beer or something like that, that's when the dopamine starts firing, and that's when your motivation gets triggered and you experience the craving for that item. So it's the dopamine response gets transferred onto the sensory predictors, the predictors of those nutrients. And that's kind of how the brain works, and that's how cravings work. So eventually the things that predict the receipt of those nutrients are the things that stimulate your motivational drive and cause you to experience a craving.
So going back to evolution, obviously this is not a malfunction. This is a feature, not a bug, right? Obviously, our ancestors, hunter-gatherers, it was useful to pick up cues that there might be game there or berries there. So it's not a defect, but how is it then coming back to the modern mismatch? What's gone wrong in that cue signaling that's driven cravings to the point where people overeat? Because it existed already in our ancestors, right?
Yeah, and it existed long before humans existed.
Right.
These brain structures that regulate this go all the way back to lampreys before the evolution of most of the types of fish that we know today. So this is extremely deep. And as you said, it's not a malfunction. It's how our brains are designed to operate.
Right.
This is the process that happens even when we eat healthy foods.
Right.
But the problem is that the system gets overstimulated with modern, highly processed foods. And essentially what we have done over the course of history through the progress of technology and affluence, we have become better and better at extracting and recombining the quote active ingredients, the active dopamine releasing ingredients in food.
So it's more concentrated. It's more concentrated now.
Yeah. So, it used to be that humans would get salt from Whole Foods, or maybe sometimes from seawater or from blood. And now we have 100% pure salt in unlimited quantities to add to anything we want. Sugar is the same way. You used to be able to get it from fruit or honey. Honey is pretty concentrated, but now we have it in 100% concentrated form to add to anything we want. Glutamate, that's another one, that umami flavor. Processed food is full of that stuff. And usually it won't say monosodium glutamate. It'll say like yeast extract or some other thing where like
hydrolyzed vegetable protein.
Yeah.
Same thing.
It'll be something where it's the same thing, but it's not something you would recognize in the ingredients list, but it's still, the same compound doing the same thing to your brain. And so everywhere you look, essentially we have mastered the active ingredients, quote unquote, in food and recombine them to maximally stimulate our own palates. And so we are surrounded by food that is simply more tempting than what our ancestors would have experienced. And that's not to say that they never ate anything tasty. Sometimes they did, like there was honey, there were fruit, there was meat. Sometimes the meat was fatty. So it's not like there were never anything that tasted good at all.
But it just wasn't available in as concentrated a form, right? So there was no way to.
Yeah. And you think about the meat, for example, which is probably one of the tastier things they would eat. Most of these cultures didn't have salt. So you're not salting it. You're not putting herbs all over it. You're cooking it the best you can over an open fire. And some parts are burned, some parts are raw. And, it's not up to modern cuisine standards, even the stuff that would have been relatively tasty. So basically we've just like, through all of the methods, cooking methods and extracting ingredients and, absolutely abundant availability of everything, we've just kind of like optimized the entertainment of our own palates.
So we're getting abnormal secretion of dopamine in response to these hyperpalatable foods. And you've mentioned dopamine now several times here. In the popular press, the word dopamine is thrown around, all the time. All addictions come down to dopamine, whether it's smartphones or sex or gambling or anything else. But what is dopamine? Can you say more about that? And how does that work in the brain? Is dopamine about pleasure? You've used the term reward, and does dopamine happen before you eat or after you eat? So say more about dopamine. What is it and how does it work in our brain?
Yeah. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is involved in motivation and learning. And it is often associated with pleasure in the popular press, but that's not well supported by the evidence. So dopamine is really a learning and motivation chemical, and it does absolutely play a critical central role in those processes, and particularly that kind of like visceral craving level motivation. I'm not talking about the kind of motivation where you're like, man, I should really put my shoes on and go for a jog right now, and I'm gonna force myself to do it. That's not the kind of motivation I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kind where you have to force yourself not to do it.
Not to do it. Yeah.
There's a slice of pizza in front of you and you're smelling it and you're like, I really shouldn't have another one. That's the kind of motivation we're talking about, more of a visceral craving level. And
so the dopamine happens before you acquire the object of your desire, or it happens after? When does dopamine go up?
Yeah, so it's an incredibly elegant system, and to walk you through that, because there's not a yes or no answer to that. So to walk you through that, I'll take you through a hypothetical example. Let's go through Ivan Pavlov's experiment, because I think that really can illustrate this well. And Pavlov did his research before we knew what dopamine was, but now we know what role dopamine plays in this sort of thing. So what Pavlov did is he noticed that when he would come in to feed the dogs that he would do his experiments with, they would start salivating like crazy. So they would start drooling. And so they were experiencing behavioral and physiological activation in preparation for ingestion of that food. And that food is what's called an unconditioned stimulus. So that means they innately have a motivational response to that food. Now, what he showed subsequently was if he just rang a bell, it was a meaningless stimulus if he just rang a bell. And the dogs didn't really respond to it. Meaningless stimulus. However, if he started ringing the bell at the same time that he gave them food, eventually the dogs would come to salivate and have that anticipatory behavioral and physiological response in response to the bell itself.
They made the association.
Ring the bell and,
the association
would salivate.
Yeah, okay.
And so what happens there is initially the dopamine is associated with the food. It's getting released with the food. But as that association forms, as the brain comes to understand that the bell is a reliable predictor of the food, the dopamine signal transfers over to the bell.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's no longer being released with the food, it's being released with the bell. And so essentially, and it gets a little bit more complicated than that, because dopamine essentially, it tunes your brain to the value of the item that it's responding to. So if you ring the bell, then they get the dopamine response, and then you bring the food out. But if that food is not as good as it usually is, if the food is not as rewarding as usual, there will actually be a negative dopamine response as they eat the food.
A disappointment.
Dopamine will actually drop.
All right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And if the food is better than usual, there'll be a bump in the dopamine as they eat the food. And that retunes for next time, retunes how intense their motivational drive should be when they hear that bell. And so maybe if the food is consistently bad after the bell, then, maybe they won't salivate as much, won't get as excited about it. Over time, they'll tune the strength of their association. But if the food is always the same, then there's no tuning that happens when they actually receive the food, and there's no change in dopamine. And they just get this bump when the bell rings.
Okay, so you form this association, and the more you then experience this cue, the bell or the aroma of the bun or the whatever, that dopamine comes back and it keeps getting reinforced. Once you've consumed the food, it goes away? So is it really just the buildup that teaches you to pursue the food, or do you get a lingering pleasure afterward and the dopamine stays high?
Well, initially, if you're eating a new food that you've never had before, then, and it has a lot of, let's say, fat and carbohydrate together, which seems to stimulate a particularly powerful dopamine response. If you're having that for the first time, then you're going to get a big dopamine burst when you consume that food. And that is teaching your brain that that's a really valuable food. But over time, when you have that multiple times, that dopamine is going to transfer onto the sensory cues, like the smell of it, the appearance of it, things that predict it. But it's at that point, it's already been stamped into your brain that that's a highly valuable, motivating food. And the only thing that's going to change that is if you then consume that food again and it's either better or worse than your expectation. And then dopamine will retune your motivation level at the time of consumption.
So you can.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, I see. You can, or also how about if you don't experience the cue for a long time, will there be a fading or extinction effect too?
Yes.
Or will it just stay there?
No, that there is a fading that happens. And I don't know. I would guess that does relate to lower dopamine response over time. But I don't know whether probably research has been done on that. I haven't looked into it. But certainly on a behavioral and motivational level, yes, there is a forgetting that happens. And those motivational circuits will weaken over time. Just to give an analogy that I think is helpful, that most people will have at least some familiarity with. If someone is addicted to cigarettes and they're trying to quit, they're having those cigarettes have been strongly dopamine reinforced. And so they have this strong behavioral drive and craving to smoke cigarettes. When they stop smoking cigarettes, initially they're going to have really strong cravings to continue smoking cigarettes. But if you don't smoke for a week, the cravings are going to diminish. And if you don't smoke for a month, they're going to diminish even more. And then by the time you haven't smoked for a year, you probably won't even want to smoke at all. You probably think it's gross. And so there is this process of forgetting that happens with these dopamine mediated stimuli, dopamine reinforced stimuli. And that happens with food as well.
So can we use this, so you've said that these sort of supernormal stimuli in our current diet ramp up the reinforcement, ramp up the dopamine. Can we use this knowledge to decondition or to extinguish this by avoiding these foods and eating I think you've used the term bland, a blander or less palatable food? It doesn't have to be boring, but can we actually get on a different path by understanding this?
Yeah. And I think there are a variety of different ways of doing this. And I think most popular weight loss diets actually are already leveraging this to some degree, because the really kind of one of the key killer elements for stimulating dopamine is combining carbs and fat together. That really gets the circuits going. And what we see is that people who go on low carb or low fat diets tend to eat less and lose weight as a result, without having to necessarily deliberately restrict their calorie intake. Their appetites just naturally diminish and they lose weight. And, if obesity were all about one macronutrient, then you would expect to see one of those diets making people gain weight and the other people losing weight. But really what seems to be the case is eating both abundantly is super fattening, and taking out either one is slimming. And I think the most obvious explanation for that is the food reward idea, that it's really the combination that is the problem, because it stimulates our motivational circuits to eat. And so go ahead.
So that's separating out the individual ingredients, but there's also the component of flavor, right, too. So less palatable can be just dialing down the flavor itself. And going back to these observations from Stephan, breaking that flavor calorie association. There was you probably remember Seth Roberts, who was active in Ancestral Health Society, and he had this funny diet called Shangri-La diet. He said, just eat calories with very little flavor, or eat flavor with very little calories. And it actually, I tried it. It does work. I don't know how sustainable it is, but generalizing that a little bit more, making sure that you don't have a flavor bomb in combination with the calories. Does that make some sense to you? Or is it just about the calorie combination?
I mean, ultimately it comes down to how many calories you're eating, I think, but what's the most sustainable path to that, I think is the question. And, I think you can envision different ways of controlling your calorie intake that are either trying to work with these non-conscious brain systems or are pitting different brain systems against one another. So the calorie counting approach is kind of taking your conscious rational brain and pitting it against your appetite circuits and other non-conscious circuits that are trying to get you to eat more. So I would say that working on lowering the reward value of your diet is more trying to recruit those non-conscious circuits to support your conscious goals. So I think that controlling or limiting the reward value of the diet is one lever that you can use. It's not the only lever that you can use to control appetite, but it is a lever. And I think it's something that people can experiment with. I think different people are going to respond better or worse to it. But I think it's a tool in the toolbox. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. So looking at diets then, and applying this, do you have a favored diet? Do you have an opinion about paleo, keto, or low fat, or vegan, or Mediterranean? Do you think any of them could in principle work, or is there one that you gravitate toward based on
in terms of weight control?
Weight control and also this understanding of appetite.
Yeah. So I think, I'm also very kind of pragmatic and empirical about this stuff. There have been a lot of studies that have been done on weight loss diets, and there are a lot of data we can look at. So part of it is just, what does the evidence say about what diets cause weight loss and how sustainable are they in the average person? And I think that, the first thing to acknowledge is that weight loss diets are not super effective in the average person. So the average person is not going from having obesity to being lean with these diets. It's more like, 10 pounds of weight loss at the 1 year mark. Usually people will lose more around the 6 month, and then they'll regain some of it, and maybe they're 10 pounds down on average. And part of that's just adherence. Like, people generally have a hard time sticking to any diet for more than a few months. They just go back to their old preferences and habits, and they might be struggling against appetite issues as well. But if you look at the evidence that's been published, basically you can use a wide variety of different diets and lose weight. Low carb diets are some of the most effective. Higher protein diets are effective. Low fat diets are effective. And there's been less. So I would say, if we're going from first principles, like what diet is going to kind of maximize some of the properties that I think are important for a weight loss diet, I would point toward the old school Cordain style paleo as a really good contender. And
can you define that a little bit more? Is that
yeah, I will.
Yeah.
And I want to say that there's not a lot of really high quality empirical evidence on that. So I just want to acknowledge that. I think based on the principles, I would expect it to be one of the more effective diets, but we don't have really solid randomized controlled trial evidence demonstrating the long run impacts. So Cordain style is higher protein. It's based on unrefined omnivorous diet. It's low-ish in carbohydrate, but it's not particularly low in carbohydrate. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, but I think it's something like 30% carbohydrate calories. And then the fat component focusing on unrefined fats and more unsaturated fats. And so just to list also some of the things that it doesn't contain or de-emphasizes: processed foods of any kind, sugar sweetened beverages, dietary salt, grains, both refined and unrefined, and legumes like beans and peas. So that's an overview of what the diet is, and the properties that I think are important in terms of weight control: the higher protein, the lower calorie density that comes from eating whole, water-rich and fiber-rich and protein-rich foods, the moderate palatability that you get from eating whole foods and not eating much salt and not eating these, super processed, craveable foods like chips and pizza and things. So I think there's a combination of factors in that diet that I think should tend to promote weight control better than your average diet, kind of on first principles. That's what I think. But again, I do wish the empirical evidence was stronger.
Mm-hmm. No, good point. And it sounds like it's for a combination of reasons. Some of it is the relationship to appetite stimulation that we've talked about for most of this podcast, but there's other factors relating to the macronutrients and their interaction with our energy balance systems, right? Hormones like leptin, insulin, things like that as well, right? That we haven't really discussed. But so would you say it's both the impact on the reward circuitry, but also other factors that also enter in?
Reward and satiety, I think, are two big ones. And I want to say, so just to unpack the satiety thing a little bit to make sure that people are following, I mean fullness. So how full you're feeling, particularly per calorie that you're eating. So foods differ greatly in how much satiety they cause per calorie that you're eating. And if you have lower calorie density, higher protein, higher fiber foods, you're going to get more satiety per calorie. And that will cause you to naturally terminate your meal, having eaten fewer calories, but still feeling satisfied. And if you look at the weight loss drugs that have been really successful, the most successful, including the ones currently that are doing so well, what you see is they generally are targeting both appetite, like the hunger piece, the satiety piece, and the reward piece. So the most effective weight loss drugs are targeting both. And I tend to think that the most effective diets are also going to target both of those.
Both systems, right?